Yeah, welcome everybody here to the kickoff meeting in Amsterdam for the AFB STEP consortium. And I'm here with John Camm, who was nice enough to be here and to join us for this conference and for this kickoff meeting. And John, maybe I can ask you, what is the role you will have during the next 48 months in this consortium?
I think it's very important to say that I'm not really central to the consortium because others have done all the hard work. I've been invited later on in the whole process in order to take charge of one of the advisory committees to the group. And the advisory committee that I'm going to be looking after is an ethics committee. And of course, for a large program of research involving lots of patient material, it's a great challenge from an ethical perspective. There are lots of potential problems with the transfer of data between one country and another, with different rules for different countries and even within the European Union, for example. And so we have to be very careful about how all of that is dealt with. And I have no doubt that from time to time there will be problems that arise, and we're going to have to work out from an ethical perspective what the consortium can do and should do. And it will be a really interesting challenge, I think, to look into how we deal with putting a huge amount of data together from across many parts of Europe and broader, for example, in Canada. It is a great opportunity to get a very large and exceptionally large data set, but there are challenges in actually getting it all in one place so that we can make the analyses that will be so fundamental to the outcome of this whole program.
So what do you think is the major strength of the program? I mean, there have been a lot of endeavors to try to get data together, to try to align AF burden with outcome parameters. And what do you think make this AFB STEP consortium so unique, or what is special, and why do you think it's worthwhile spending your time with this consortium to maybe come up with better measures for AF outcomes than we had right now?
Well, I think that we've been measuring AF burden for the last maybe 6 to 8 years, but the studies have been very small. The way in which we've measured burden has differed between studies, and the way it's all been analyzed is very different. In particular, the kind of patient that has been studied and the outcomes that have been looked at and the whole methodology of deriving AF burden has differed between the studies. So there's no comparability. It's been very difficult to compare the results of one study with that of another study. So the great advantage of this collaboration within this program is the ability not only to set standards for within the program and for the analysis that is being made, but also to suggest for the outside program world that the definitions that we come up with and the processes that we are using within this program can be part of the guidelines for the management of AF burden, the understanding of AF burden, and the use of AF burden across the North Americas and Europe at least, if not wider than that.
Nobody besides you has so much experience with atrial fibrillation in epidemiology, in the entire field of electrophysiology within the last couple of years. So when it comes to clinical judgment, I mean, this is where we come from. We've rose more questions than answers in the last couple of years with the data that we were providing from large-scale randomized controlled trials. What do you think at the end of this consortium when we publish the data that's coming out of this phenomenal collection of data? What is the clinical impact that people may be able to look forward to ease their patient therapy?
Well, I think we've been looking for some time for a way of characterizing the amount of atrial fibrillation that a patient suffers. And we've had a variety of techniques for doing that. The techniques have been different from time to time. We've had different approaches to the measurement of burden, the interpretation of burden. We've done lots of comparisons of burden with other methodologies, such as the 3P classification and so on and so forth. But so far, we haven't moved very far. So the advantage, I think, of this program is that there is an opportunity to move forward, several steps forward, we hope, so that we can, with proper and detailed data collection and appropriate analysis, lead to clinical messages on how to care for our patients. Who needs what? And does it depend, and how does it depend on the amount of atrial fibrillation, the burden of the arrhythmia, the so-called AF burden, and how much depends on many other interrelated factors. And one big advantage of this program is that it's not stopping with just measuring AF burden. It's also looking at how that AF burden should be integrated in the rest of the clinical profile, and it should be tuned to the outcomes that you want to discuss and detect. And so I think that finally we're going to have a big enough program to make many of those features much clearer. And when we do, we'll have a much better way of deciding how to treat our patients.
Yeah, that would be a great expectation that we're having. Do you think that it's also changing the way we may treat patients in the future? I mean, if we look at the outcome in more granularity, let's say air burden has more granularity than just looking at 30 seconds, yes or no. Do you think this opens also the space for other therapies rather than just ablation, which is now first-line therapy for most of the indications? Do you think that this opens the window also for other pharmaceutical therapies?
I do. I think, first of all, I should say that AF burden allows us to study the progression or the regression of the arrhythmia. Is the atrial fibrillation getting worse? Is it getting better? And we can correlate or associate those improvements in burden or the worsening of burden with outcomes. And that will be really a very, very important consideration. We can also look at the rate at which these things are happening. Again, new parameters on which to base the way that we may treat our patients. But you're quite right in saying that looking for burden gives us a much finer idea of atrial fibrillation and its amount and whether it presents the same risks if it's a very small amount or a very large amount. So far, it's been a simple decision. Is there atrial fibrillation or is there not atrial fibrillation? And most of our treatment algorithms depend on that single binary decision. Now we're going to have a way of looking whether small amounts of atrial fibrillation need treatment, both in terms of does it present a threat at the moment, will it progress? For example, these are unanswered questions at the moment. If we look at just the time to the first recurrence of an atrial fibrillation event, we get the impression, because we're only measuring a very tiny amount of atrial fibrillation, that often we're not doing much good with the treatments that we offer. But if we can actually measure the extent of the atrial fibrillation, we can see that it falls dramatically in its amount, so-called AF burden, and that may signal that that patient is well treated. And if we're only left with a small residual amount of atrial fibrillation, ongoing treatments such as anticoagulation may not be necessary. So it may have profound effects on the way that we go forward with the management of our patients with atrial fibrillation.
So it's going to be very exciting. Once we have this data, we've overcome all these obstacles that you were mentioning at the beginning, what we end up with in terms of the data that we're going to have and how it's going to translate to our patient care. I could ask 100 further questions, but we're a little bit running out of time. John Camm, thank you so much for being here, being part of this consortium and getting us the opportunity to ask you these questions. Thank you.
It's my great pleasure.
Thank you.